Child transitioning is something that should not happen in any case. And unfortunately, I also believe that child transitioning has called into question the merits of a classically liberal society, and those merits should not be impugned by the practice. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. But my friends, for those of you who are not familiar, over the past long-standing period of time since the culture wars have been ramping up, the issue of child transitioning, that is, children receiving sex change operations to fit what is called their image of themselves, transgender children, has received a lot of play in the media. And over the past few weeks, as of the posting of this video, this matter has gotten particularly virulent because different children's hospitals who are offering services for children to transition into their desired sex or gender or whatever, what have you, are receiving death threats, and they're also receiving a lot of media attention. Boston's Children's Hospital was exposed by Billboard Chris, who is a user on Twitter who does a lot of work relating to things about wokeness and things of that sort, as offering children's sex change operations. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, or the Pittsburgh Hospital there, they also offer sex changes for children who want to conform their body to their idea of who they are. Now, my friends, this is not a video about why this necessarily is a bad thing, because I do most certainly believe that children transitioning is a little bit of a contradiction in terms. Children are not beings that have cultivated their ability to reason sufficiently, and ergo they can't make such a harsh decision. That's all fine and well. But this video, built on that presumption that I just mentioned, is more so asking two questions. Number one, how do defenses, people who defend child transitioning from the standpoint of liberty, how do their arguments make any sense, and how do we deal with their arguments? And number two, what is a classically liberal society, a society built on the virtues of free speech and tolerance, to do about actions like children transitioning? These two questions will be the guiding theme of this video, and I hope by answering these questions, we can better elucidate why these kind of activities, even under the most feasibly tolerant frameworks, cannot be permitted. It is not a matter of liberty, but instead a matter of protecting liberty, that advocates of individualism, advocates of liberty on the right, people who are American conservatives, people who believe in the power of the individual, for those reasons, should be against this practice. So, just to examine how common this practice is, because oftentimes when this stuff is talked about, the media says that it's right-wing moral outrage, but it's not. There are several examples of the medical community and the government approving of children getting these kind of operations on their bodies. For example, after the Boston Children's Hospital allegedly received threats, the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, came out and said that threats should be condemned and they will be prosecuted, which is fine. But before that, in the same statement, they said they believe in a child's right or a child's ability to decide who they are. So not only is the Department of Justice taking a legal position, which they are within their right to do, but they're also taking a moral position that actually contradicts the foundations of the DOJ and the foundations of the United States government, which is built upon natural law and objective truth, and the truth being children not having full access to their rights, since they have not necessarily developed their reasoning capabilities, can't consent to this kind of behavior. But regardless of that fundamental truth, which is a result of the premises that America is built upon, the DOJ is going to thwart them to serve their own political agenda. It's akin to when a river, a part of a river, is cut off by sediment and landfill, and that part of the river, known as an oxbow lake, is just left there to decay and die. And if enough of the river dries up, the river itself will die. America is the river. The DOJ and other agencies that go against America's principles and what this country was built upon and the constitutional moral ethos, they are the lakes that are destroying and drying up the river. Do not let the river be dried up, because if the river is dried up, America collapses and liberty dies. But also, there's even more egregious instances of individuals in the medical community endorsing this practice. Child transitioning has been endorsed writ large by the medical establishment. You can look at any major statement from medical organizations, and a lot of them support it. But not only that, but you have a doctor called Scott Messer, who runs the Gender Confirmation Center, who himself does sex change operations on individuals as young as 13. And according to Messer's own standards, he has zero problem doing sex change operations on any age, because according to his own standards, he doesn't have a minimum age on which he'll do sex change operations. Here is a video of Messer saying this right here. Go.
I do not have a minimum age of any sort in my practice. There's no chronological age that says you don't get surgery. Now, having said that, I don't think I've ever done a consult on a 12-year-old yet, but we would if one came our way. We just haven't had reason to. And then we've done a number of 13-year-olds who we did consults on. I think I've done 1 or 2 13-year-old surgeries. For the most part, it's 14 and up, that by the time everything comes together, plus insurance approval, plus everything, that surgery actually gets completed.
All right. Then you have happening in Florida, you have a group of lawyers at Lambda Legal suing Florida for barring Medicaid funds from going to gender transition. And in the lawsuit, Lambda Legal is representing 4 plaintiffs, but particularly 2 of those plaintiffs are children who are called transgender children, who themselves are trying to reap the benefits of reproductive sex change operations. Isn't it very weird that a child can be a party in a lawsuit when the matter at hand does not even concern them, or shouldn't really even concern them in all totality? So what's the point? The point here is that there are institutions and social forces in our society right now that are trying to push the envelope, push the Overton window, push the standard of acceptance towards endorsing, not only just accepting child transition, but endorsing child transition, and then exemplifying that endorsement through state funds and through private entities as well. And this sort of consortium of interests that are pushing this idea reflect 2 concerning problems. Now, a lot of people who defend child transition will oftentimes say, well, Christian, it is unfair for you to go ahead and say that children shouldn't transition. They should be able to decide what they do with their body. It's a matter of choice, a matter of consent. So I've already established that children cannot consent. That's not something that actually happens. It's a definitional impossibility. They cannot consent, which is why they have the guardianship of a parent, someone whose faculties are ripened enough to do that for them. So that's a separate issue. But that's not even at play here. But what's also very important is to note is that this idea of choice and consent being a vehicle for actions that should have, therefore, since it's consensual, should have no interference by the government, it reflects this dichotomy in politics, the public-private dichotomy. Now, many of you may not have heard about what this is, but I'll explain it very shortly. The public-private dichotomy in politics essentially says that there are 2 spheres of society. There's one sphere where the government has no business intervening, and then there's the other sphere where the government has full reign to intervene. The public sphere is the sphere where government has full reign to intervene. These are the things and these are the activities the governments can do, such as military defense, etc., etc. The private sphere is the sphere of the family and the individual. Now, this principle has been talked about by almost every single political thinker dating back to Plato in some way, shape, or form. And it's oftentimes used in post-Enlightenment modern-day society to signify the proper boundaries between legitimate state action and illegitimate state action. But here's my problem. This distinction in principle shouldn't really even exist. There is no public sphere. The government is not an entity on its own. The government is an agent of the individual against the backdrop of first principles. There is only the private sphere because the underlying legitimacy for government emerges from the consent of the governed, and the governed exist in the private sphere. But to give the government its own sphere is to treat it as if it is a person itself, or as if it is this all-extensive entity entity which has legitimate interest in itself. The interest of the government is A, the interest of the principles it was founded upon, i.e. the protection of individual rights, and B, in the context of protecting individual rights, then going ahead and answering to those who they are governing, i.e. who they are protecting. The government is an agent of the individual. It is not its own independent entity. Therefore, there is no public realm. There is a private realm in which there is an entity that is in common to the rest of that realm. That's the thing that we have to understand here. So, when you say that it's against choice, so to speak, when the government goes ahead and says, or if the government were to go ahead and say that children cannot transition, what you're doing is presenting this public-private dichotomy where it does not exist. The fact is, the government exists to protect rights. And children, because they cannot access their rights, since you must have the fully developed ability of reason to access and utilize your rights, are therefore have a unique interest in being protected. The government's duty as an agent of the individual puts it in that position. This is not a matter of choice or distinction. This is a matter of moral necessity, because if the government did not protect kids from this kind of stuff, it would not be doing its job. Now, there are some times when the government tries to protect children and they end up creating bureaucracy, like CPS. There's a lot of problems with child protective services. A lot of problems with that. That's a separate story. But the point is, when there are identifiable cases of children being manipulated or contorted in a direction that they cannot feasibly deal with mentally, the government has an interest in stepping in and fighting that, because the government is a rights protection agency in principle. Now, the broader issue is this. How does a classically liberal society deal with such ideas? Now, in Karl Popper, he's a theorist, he's a philosopher from the 20th century, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. He had this book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. And in this book, Popper goes through several different theories posed by tyrants, posed by tyrannical political thinkers, that go against the open society, the free society, so to speak, the society in which discourse and toleration is encouraged. And one of the most famous parts of that book is a quote that he pulls out, or when he's talking about Plato, where he says that there's a sort of paradox of tolerance, that a tolerant society cannot tolerate bad ideas lest it itself is destroyed and thus becomes intolerant. Therefore, for a tolerant society to be tolerant, it must be intolerant. This is the paradox of tolerance. Now, a lot of people mistake this as an endorsement on Popper's behalf to these principles. Popper was not endorsing the idea of being intolerant towards intolerant beliefs. In fact, he very clearly says that we should use our rational powers to beat back intolerant beliefs. However, having said that, there is a very clear question here. What are the limits of tolerance in a society based on tolerance, based on free speech, and based on the primacy, the moral primacy of the individual and the limitations of government thereof? Well, the limits of tolerance are a little bit more complicated than a lot of people like to think. See, my friends, when a tolerant society becomes intolerant, you can quickly lapse into tyranny. This is what happened during the Red Scare. This is what happens when the power structure in the United States, the administrative state, goes after people, because they go after people all the time, whom they disagree with politically. This is what happens. You have these structures becoming intolerant to keep the current status of society that they have. But oftentimes, toleration is mistaken as this value that says everything goes, and everything within a certain limit goes. And a lot of people, since they tie toleration to individual choices and consent, would say, okay, we have to tolerate the idea of there being transgender children because they can consent or they can choose what they want to be in life. Well, now that we've dealt with that idea that children can actually consent and choose, they can't because their faculties are not ripe enough. But also, this is also a very interesting point to make here. The idea that a tolerant society is a society in which every single person has an equal stake in that tolerance is quite fascinating. Obviously, a tolerant society does not tolerate child molesters. Obviously, a tolerant society does not tolerate terrorists. And obviously, it takes a while, in general, before someone can arrive at a point in which their opinion on toleration is at all considered substantial. Why in the world should a society, a classically liberal society, tolerate the idea of child transitioning when we have established that children are at a reduced moral capacity because they don't have an understanding of what is going on? Toleration cannot really be extended to people who are not moral agents. All people are moral agents, but if that person doesn't understand that, or they have a reduced ability to know that, then toleration has to take into account that effect. If toleration is a moral value, now if toleration is a utility, if it is a means to an end, then it's not really a value whatsoever. It is a tool, like any other tools that can be discarded. And that perspective, in my opinion, is quite bleak and dangerous. But if toleration is a value that society holds dear, then that value must be magnified by moral agents. And that value must be extended to people who actually understand what's going on. And if those people do not understand what's going on, it's the job for their caretakers to implement that principle on their behalf. So once again, it always goes back to the parents. A tolerant society cannot tolerate immoral behavior if it itself, toleration, is a moral principle. If toleration is a moral principle, it exists within a system of ethics that society is built upon. And in the case of American society, we have a very clear system of ethics, a clear system of ethics based upon the idea of natural law, based upon the idea of the consent of the governed, based upon the idea of separation of powers, based upon the idea of the individual acknowledging and seeking out their rights through their ability to reason, based upon the idea of constraining your passions and not allowing them to overtake your ability to be a rational being, based upon the idea of you respecting your neighbor, based upon the idea of people being sociable and social creatures, based upon the idea, all these ideas all feed into the same system, which gives more legitimacy to the American government, and any government, in all honesty, because these are universal principles. But the moment you try to enter into the system, a virus, so to speak, that says, okay, we'll tolerate this blatant violation of ethics here to be tolerant, is the moment the moral system is compromised. Forget about the society itself becoming intolerant. The basis upon which the society decides what is tolerant and what is intolerant, that becomes compromised. And if that becomes compromised, then meaning becomes uncertain. And we already live in a postmodern era where meaning of a lot of things, whether it be the definition of a woman or the sanctity of children, is uncertain. So anyone who cares about natural ethics, anyone who understands the nature and condition of childhood, anyone who understands the duty and obligation a parent has to their kid, will not accept the idea of a transgender child even being a definitional possibility because it is a conceptual absurdity. It doesn't exist. There are confused children, there are curious children, there are questioning children, but there are no transgender children. To be transgender or to not be transgender is a condition of a mature being, of an adult. And for adults who go through that stuff, I have made videos about this. I have nothing against those adults who feel as if they don't reflect their idea of themselves. I get no problem with that. That is for them to decide and deal with. That's not my business. But it becomes my business when people, political interest, the medical intelligentsia, universities, the government, as I have looked at in all these cases, begin to push people, particularly the most vulnerable amongst us, towards a condition, an end that is morally fraught and ultimately destructive to the virtues of a society. If toleration is a moral value, we cannot tolerate the idea of a transgender child. We must protect the innocence of childhood and leave those considerations to adulthood. That is how the classical liberal overcomes the challenge of toleration, by understanding where it comes from and preserving that foundation. My friends, think on it. I love you guys so much. If you love me, please go to my Patreon, patreon.com/PhilCWatson, or my PayPal, officialcwatch@gmail.com. Be sure to like on this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment on this video. My friends, I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.